A few examples. The Black Lives Matter platform, who's read it? It's a profound document. In the Black Lives Matter platform was this 2 sentences that Israel was an apartheid state and practiced genocide. And it pitted activists in the Jewish community and activists in the Black Gentile community. And when the platform came out, so first I went to the dictionary to just look up the word genocide and decide, did I think the oppression of Palestinians? And then I realized that was the wrong thing. People were fighting about those words. The Black Lives Matter platform that was profound really needed to have total focus on criminal justice work, ended up pitting 2 important communities. That's the function of anti-Semitism. The second example was the Women's March. And I was listening on NPR this morning, they were talking about, because it's tomorrow again. And I did so much work around the march last year. And again, all this accusation of anti-Semitism. And what happens is people then get caught up in, is the Women's March anti-Semitic? Was what somebody said anti-Semitic? It had such a devastating effect on this very powerful women's movement. I was there at the march last year, and all these news reporters kept coming up to me and some of my buddies and saying, tell us about the anti-Semitism. And we were like, well, we're actually here to talk about sexism. We're actually here to talk about women's liberation. And that it just divides our movements. The same thing happened in England around Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. The Labour Party got decimated. And again, we do need to take on anti-Semitism where it is spoken and said and communicated, but it gets systematically used to divide our movements. So whenever there's big fights in any of our liberation movements around Jews or Israel, that is the mechanism of anti-Semitism. And the third and last component is, are Jews or Israel being isolated out? Because the dynamic of Jewish oppression, again, Jews were ghettoized, separated out from the peoples of the world. So for example, I do a lot of work on campuses, and there's so many issues now on campuses. There was a particular group of Jewish students that wanted to participate in an environment coalition on their campus. They were asked to sign a statement that Zionism is racism in order to participate in an environment coalition. It is a litmus test that no other group on no other issue is being asked. And again, there's all kinds of conversation to be had about how are we going to end the oppression of Palestinians and end the occupation, but needing to sign a litmus test to participate in any coalitions that had nothing to do with the issue around Israel and Palestine is isolating. So these Jewish students got completely isolated out from being able to participate in progressive work. So those are the three: singled out for blame, used as a diversion to divert and rip apart our movements, or the isolation of Jews and or Israel from the rest of the world's peoples. When any of those criteria are there, that then is the dynamic and function of anti-Semitism. And I will stop there. I also just will say that some of the materials I mentioned, I have some of them here for people to take afterwards.
Wow. Okay. Our next speaker is Tina Sachs. Tina is a friend and an assistant professor at UC Berkeley School of Social Welfare. And she studies racial inequalities in health and social determinants of health. She also has written a book about that, Invisible Visits, Black Middle-Class Women in the American Healthcare System. And Tina's going to talk about her unique identity and positionality, and I'm really excited to have her here. Yay.
So first, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this symposium. It's really interesting for me, and thank you all for coming. Like Laura, I don't study this. Unlike Sherry, I am a social worker. I don't know where that leaves me right now. But I really want to just tell a little bit of a story from my own personal experience that I think illustrates some of the issues that we're facing here as we think about social work and how to study social work, how to study racism and anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish oppression in the context of social work, both practice and scholarship. And so I'm going to talk really from my own personal experience, which really begins from my own upbringing and the struggles of of all of my ancestors. And so my story really emerges from both sets of my grandparents. My maternal grandparents were J.B. and Lucille, and my paternal grandparents were David and Dora. Both sets of my grandparents were essentially forced to flee the places they lived. They were both essentially ghettoized, and they left the places they lived in search of a better life for their children. And in that way, both of their stories are really archetypal immigrant stories, right? But my paternal grandmother, Dora, she came to the United States after enduring many, many pogroms in what is now Belarus. She told me once that she remembered hiding in a barn for several days as her shtetl was looted and burned. And at that point, her family knew that they had to try to get out, that they had to try to had to emigrate somewhere else. They were able to make arrangements to come to the United States. And she came when she was 19 to the United States by herself. She had a sibling here in New York City, actually. And her parents and extended family stayed behind, only to later perish during World War II. And on my mom's side, my maternal grandfather had to flee the back-breaking labor and exploitation of sharecropping, the ever-present possibility of lynching and racial violence, and the perpetual second-class citizenship of living in Mississippi during the Jim Crow era. My paternal grandmother and maternal grandfather both ended up in Chicago, which paved the way for me to exist and to stand here today. When my father was young, the family actually lived in Jewish enclaves in Chicago, which is where I'm from. My grandparents owned a grocery store, and they would actually, my grandmother would write down in Yiddish the orders that they would take. They would deliver Shabbat dinner packages to families in the neighborhood well before there was anything like Blue Apron or HelloFresh. Bobby Dora was getting it done. And my aunt, who was born in the 1930s, actually described seeing many businesses. When she would go look for jobs in retail establishments in Chicago, she would tell me that there were signs at the time that said blacks and Jews need not apply. And my father also recalled being taunted with anti-Semitic slurs on the playground. He got into a few fights, physical fights, as a result of that, trying to defend himself. My mother, too, faced brutal race and gender discrimination everywhere, in the labor market, in housing, on the street. Pretty much everywhere she turned, she was passed over for jobs, or if she did get the job, she was frequently sexually harassed, sexually assaulted on the job, or earned much less than other people in similar positions. Also in Chicago, many of you may be familiar with the Black Belt of Chicago. She was always forced to live in the Black Belt. So again, the sort of the ghettoization, the being forced, isolated into living in certain areas. She described the terror of living with rats, not mice, in her apartment because of the substandard housing that she was forced to endure. And later my parents met at work. My dad was a lawyer and my mother was a court reporter. They got married, they had me, they bought a house in an Irish Catholic enclave on Chicago's South Side. And although my dad is not particularly religious, he always carried a sense of himself as a cultural minority. So living amongst all of the Catholic churches was a bit off-putting for him. And of course for my mom and my older brother, who was my mom's child from a previous marriage, living in an all-white Catholic neighborhood was more than just psychically difficult. The threat of physical violence was always present. Our house was frequently vandalized. My brother was frequently chased home by mobs of teenage boys with baseball bats. This was not an easy upbringing. We were big tennis players also. This was a thing that my mom and dad somehow shared. I don't know how my mom, who was grew up in the Jim Crow South, but she really loved tennis, and my dad loved tennis too. So they tried to join a tennis club also on the south side of Chicago, and they were told in the 1980s, both of them, that we don't take blacks or Jews, so you can't be a member. At any rate, for both sides of my family, the journey has been difficult, joyful, triumphant, and at times very sad. And although both sides of my family share similar journeys and challenges, obviously we can't talk about anti-Semitism and discrimination without talking about race, without talking about the processes of racialization that happened particularly in the United States, and racism itself. For example, when my grandmother passed away, I found her immigration papers when she came through Ellis Island, and her race was listed as Hebrew. Her first language was Yiddish. She never learned to read or write in English. But in Chicago, she blended in because she was white. Or to be more precise, she belonged to the socially constructed category of whiteness. And her son, my father, was able to parlay his white maleness into upward mobility. My mother did not have that malleability. She was easily identified as the other, and she faced systemic barriers as a result. So to bring this back to the main points we are charged with considering in this panel, I think recognizing the interconnectedness of the human struggle against racism and anti-Semitism, other forms of discrimination through time, as evidenced by both sides of my family's story, may sound naive or kumbaya, but it is imperative as we navigate this period of intense polarization, as we are coming through a cycle here, as Sherry mentioned. But connectedness and allegiance is only possible, to my mind, when we acknowledge both points of convergence and divergence. So first, I believe that as social work scholars and practitioners, as human beings, we have a responsibility to acknowledge that the roots of anti-Semitism run very deep and are also very current, very present. This is not in the dustbin of history. It is present now. And second, that that anti-Semitism and racism are closely related and often, as Sherry mentioned, used as a cudgel by the same actors, right? By Trump and other Unite the Right, white nationalists, etc. Third, that we acknowledge, particularly in this present moment, that the threat of violence is real, which creates a sense of terror and anxiety across the community as whole, as it is intended to do. And fourth, that Jewish people of color in particular face both the bodily and psychological harms caused by this threat of violence. And that, very importantly here, I think, as we're thinking about social work and social work scholarship and social work practice, that people of color, and particularly Black people, face an additional set of structural harms. So housing discrimination, mass incarceration, police violence, etc. And this suggests that in order to effectively engage, we need to be thoughtful about the similarities and differences between these forms of discrimination, their manifestations, and our responses therein. So in closing, I'd like to bring our attention to many, many allies who are thinking and acting in this area, trying to build on a shared history and a present to act now. So, for example, Never Again, a group of Jewish people who are getting out and trying to disrupt what's happening in ICE detention facilities, I think is just, my students often accuse me of being negative. And so I always want to provide an example of people who are acting together to disrupt systems of power and oppression. And so I just wanted to bring your attention to them. And their tagline is, never again para nadie. So we really are all in this together. We just have to, I think, be both critical. We need to be critical and think about the areas of our convergence and divergence. And lastly, I just want to say all power to the people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really, truly moving. Thank you. Our next speaker on the panel is Ray Engel, who's a professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work. And Dr. Engel has been a faculty member for, he told me, 32 years at the University of Pittsburgh. And one of the reasons, so when I was thinking about putting a panel together on this topic, I thought about the Tree of Life synagogue shooting that had occurred and not so long ago. And I reached out to Dean Farmer and asked, would someone from the school want to maybe share their experience? And I know this isn't an easy thing to talk about, Ray, and I really appreciate that you're able to be here with us to share your experience. And so Ray is also not a scholar of anti-Semitism. We share that, the three scholars on the panel. And he studies low-wage work and income inequality and lots of other issues. You might have used his textbook on social research methods. I know I have, Engel and Shoot. Sorry. And Ray is a member of a congregation that meets at the synagogue where the shooting occurred. And so one of the questions in our discussions and kind of working around this panel, I wanted him to talk a bit about what can social workers do in response to all the layers of anti-Semitism and its intersections that we've talked about today. So I don't know if that's what he's going to talk about, but that's what I asked him to talk about. All right.
This is really personal, so a friend of mine suggested I type my comments. Those who know me in class, I usually come with a postcard and I can sit and talk for 3 hours. But this is quite personal. I want to frame a few of my comments, in part reiterating a little what Laura said in her introduction. One of my dear friends said, "Your name is Raphael Engel, and let the world know that you are Raphael Yaakov ben Harav Meir Umeira." I have been a faculty member at the School of Social Work for 32 years. I am a member of Dor Chadash. It's a progressive and egalitarian lay-led congregation. My congregation was attacked with 2 others, Tree of Life, where 11 people were murdered on October 27, 2018. So to be able to maintain my composure, I'm not going to talk about that at all. Unless you ask me later about it, I'm happy to. Part of my recent growth of a scholar is I have learned more about trauma in the last 1.5 years than I ever thought I would ever want to know. I want to thank Laura for asking me to join these really great panelists. They both do extraordinary work. I think we're all looking at each other on our websites saying, oh, wow, that's really great. They come with great expertise. I remember Laura's invitation and her comment that this is the first such panel at SWR. I could stop here really and say, okay, that's the story. This is the first panel after all this time. I will tell you, silence sometimes can be really deafening, and social work has been really deafening. There's nothing new about anti-Semitism. It's been around for, a few millennia, so we have a lot of catching up to do. It's the absence in the canon of social work education and research is only reinforced by not having a focus at SWR over all these years. Anti-Semitism is real, its roots are long, and it seems to cut along political perspectives. It is persistent. It has been used to deflect attention from other problems by those in power, and it has been used to separate groups, and I think both of you have given great examples of how that occurs. Ultimately, it really begs the question, not what is social work's response to anti-Semitism, but why has it taken us so long to wake up? I will tell you, in my own community, communities and people aren't waiting for social work to be leaders. We're doing things. In my own community, the Holocaust Center in Pittsburgh has been engaged in educating teachers and students not just about the Holocaust, but how the entirety of the Holocaust connects to the many injuries of today. Last month, an art and photography exhibit opened in Pittsburgh called Stones and Roses. This exhibit is focused on the violence that's been perpetrated on both the African American and Jewish communities. Stones represent the Jewish tradition of leaving stones at a grave. Roses symbolize the shooting of Antoine Rose, an unarmed African American teen shot in the back by police, and the subsequent acquittal of the officer who shot him. When Donald Trump came to Pittsburgh on his visit to Tree of Life 3 days after the attack, he was greeted by several thousand protesters in a march organized by Bend the Arc, a Jewish left organization. The lead banner read, and this is the one that many people saw in the press, President Trump, you are not welcome in Pittsburgh until you finally renounce white nationalism. So the Jewish community and its allies, and we do have allies, and they are active and they participate, aren't waiting for social work to stand up. So I'm going to talk a little about what I believe would be a necessary social work response. I believe that we must look at ourselves as educators, as researchers. We need to look at our own behaviors and practices within our schools at a micro level and discuss whether we have been complicit in silencing discussions of anti-Semitism within our social work pedagogy. And so the rest of what I'm going to talk about is kind of my experience as an academic. I'm sure many of us in the room have encountered or at least witnessed anti-Semitism in our personal lives during our own education and our work lives. Maybe it was the absence of content about Jews, let alone content about anti-Semitism in our curricula. Or maybe it was subtle or not so subtle comments that people make. Some recent examples of my own work life range from meetings and work-related events scheduled for Friday nights and Saturday, to snide comments about Jewish faculty who are aggressive or not to be trusted. 1 month before the shootings, the Student Executive Council at our school held a Meet the Dean event on Yom Kippur. the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, when you would expect even the least of religious Jews to be in synagogue. It would have been fine if there had been multiple events scheduled, but that was the only one scheduled. When I came back to school and I saw the poster, it was after Yom Kippur, I said, I guess no Jews invited or welcomed. 3 days before the shooting, an adjunct faculty told their class about their workplace. My Jewish colleagues are so annoying. I don't think I need to tell you what's wrong with that statement, and if I do, we'll have a conversation later. This year, the dean sent a memo to faculty and staff listing all the Jewish holidays, the basic times when the actual holiday begins, meaning the night before, and when there are prohibitions against work. A couple days later, the School of Social Work scheduled a career networking event for students and agencies, 5 to 7 p.m., Erev Yom Kippur. And let me say, I think my school tries. We have leadership that pays attention and is aware. The networking event, it was canceled by the dean as soon as she learned of it. This academic year, all faculty and staff were attending ADL training. We even engaged in small gestures, such as having kosher lunches available for students, faculty, and staff during orientation. It communicates the message of inclusion. What is confounding to me and continues to confound me is, despite all this, these patterns continue. During Yom Kippur, our Day of Atonement, we ask for forgiveness for our sins of commission and our sins of omission. Sins of commission are those that are wrongs that we knowingly did. Sins of omission are inadvertent and often reflect not knowing. So if we want a social work response, let's start by getting our own houses in order. These really are some simple things we can do to at least deal with the sins of omission. It's this kind of behavior we would want to model for our students. Might not like the word microaggression, but microaggressions are microaggressions. Mm-hmm. If it's ignorance, then schools of social work could provide trainings to educate their faculty and staff. It's not all that difficult to do. But don't expect your Jewish faculty to have to be the ones to do it. To paraphrase Audre Lorde, it shouldn't be the responsibility of the oppressed to educate the oppressors. Now, as a tenured faculty member, I can deal with this. Each of the deans under whom I've served, Larry Davis is here, Betsy Farmer is here, both will tell you I'm not a quiet person. And both will tell you and attest that I have no problem speaking up. And that was even before I had tenure. More challenging is to think about our pedagogy. In many schools of social work, a key theme for us is this idea of intersectionality. For some schools of social work, it's an organizing theme and it drives the curricula, and it should. We know there are relationships between race, class, gender, ethnicity, sexual identity that help us understand the cumulative effects of different forms of oppression, how they combine, and how they may overlap. And we probably do pretty good jobs of teaching it, but I challenge you, do we do the same when it comes to religious group identity? In talking about oppression, Patricia Hill Collins warns about us falling into a trap of an oppression Olympics, a hierarchy of oppression that is then used to discount those who may appear to have more privilege. I think this is a challenge for us. We want our students to be reflective of their own position and identity. I think we all agree with that. But then to put themselves into the shoes of the other, rather than discount and trivialize the experiences of those others. While other disciplines refer to this process somewhat differently, in social work, I think we kind of call that empathy. A social work student from another school published an editorial in their university newspaper, and I thought she wrote so eloquently about this problem, I'm just going to read a bit of it. My experience in the School of Social Work has often made me feel hollow. It can seem like I have no role as a Jew in both the course curriculum and in class discussions. In discussions, fellow classmates have confessed that they have become frustrated when Jewish people speak up about their experiences. She continues, intersectionality is a central theme in our curriculum that promotes a solidarity-driven approach to social justice. Unfortunately, it seems that this ideology is not being taught to address issues pertaining to anti-Semitism. Thus, Jewish students whisper to each other in the secrecy of dimly lit dive bars about our shared experiences of anti-Semitism, but we don't dare speak out in class. Whether you agree with that or not, whether that's not true in your school of social work, this is a perception, and as we know, perceptions are reality for people. I've heard similar comments from students in my own school, including, ironically, yesterday with one student telling me something, and I said, well, why didn't you speak up? And she said, I've been so conditioned at this school that I feel like this is the norm, not to speak up. So one question is, does anti-Semitism fit in? Yes, there are Jews with race privilege, but not all Jews are white. Yes, there are Jews with class privilege, but not all Jews are wealthy. Scott Nakagawa reminds us, privilege is not the same as power, and privilege is not a bulwark against white nationalism. He notes elsewhere that anti-Semitism is so effective because it creates demons out of whole groups of people based on myths, stereotypes, and the few exceptions that prove the rule. So what does this mean for me for social work education? I would argue that we must talk about the historical origins of hate. I hope we do already. But I would include anti-Semitism in this history and would do so explicitly. In so doing, we see how anti-Semitism has served as a function and a tool for dominant elites. For example, in past centuries, such hate was used by elite ruling classes to blame economic problems and hardships on the Jews. And we see those problems today as well. Aurora Levins Morales writes, the oppression of the Jews is a conjuring trick, a pressure valve, a sham that redirects the rage of working people away from the 1% and sets up the Jews. Describing the various roots of anti-Semitism, whether they derive from religious or xenophobic hatred, or based on falsely described genetic differences, will shed lights on the aggressions of today. History has also taught us that the expressions of anti-Semitism, primarily in Europe and now the US, can be cyclical, though not all groups of Jews have experienced these cycles. There are periods of prosperity, enlightenment, and growth. Jews in Spain were seen as successful in business, in medicine, law, and philosophy, and then tortured under the Inquisition and expelled from Spain in 1492. Numerous German Jews were assimilated into the culture, were scholars, thinkers, artists, and then systematically exterminated. These cycles could be understood in terms of their links to power dynamics, but they also become internalized to a culture in ways that aren't necessarily healthy for that culture. I ask you to consider that. I teach a history course to undergrads, and I show a film about Ida B. Wells and her campaign against lynching. I ask students how this relates to today, and they say racism, gender, how the media, or well, in their case, the social media, can be used to mobilize folks, and the power of economic boycott as a change agent. And what they often arrive at is how white supremacy today, that white supremacist murders today, are a modern manifestation of lynching. That the killings at a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, the killings at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, the killing of an imam and a friend leaving a New York City mosque, the racially motivated killings at El Paso, the killings at a GLBTQ club at Pulse in Orlando, the shootings at Tree of Life. These all have things in common. It's done by white supremacists who engage in hate and fear. These are designed to do just what lynching did. As educators, we need to consider our curricula and how, if at all, we address content about the heterogeneity of the Jewish community. It is far more diverse than the stereotypes that people hold, and maybe that will dispel incorrect notions about Jews. Let me go on a tangent. I use a squirrel in our house. If you've seen the movie Up, you know exactly what that is. A number of years ago, after Pennsylvania legalized casinos, but before they opened, we did a study about the readiness for social services to address gambling addiction. One of the recommendations was that agencies should include a two-item gambling screen. Shocked, we received tremendous pushback from these agencies. They said to us, we assess so much, we address so much, you want us to take on another problem? Well, it turns out gambling addiction is a real problem. Some of you may feel the same way, thinking, how do we add another ism? We have so much to teach, we have so much to discuss. Turns out anti-Semitism is a real problem. Look, these are my personal sentiments. I don't really know what goes on in all schools of social work. Maybe we're the exception. My school discusses anti-Semitism in one course, and another professor includes some content in her course. Is that sufficient? I really don't know. If you're a good researcher, you can go find out the answer. I confess, and I say this very openly, that I have been thought long and hard about my own complicity in this. Nora Gold, 25 years ago, wrote an article in the Journal of Social Work Education, and she talks about the silence of faculty. And I have been complicit, sadly, for 32 years in this as well. As a reality check, you do what you always do with the reality check. I sent what I'm going to talk about to my friends who have experiences at other universities. This is kind of their feedback. One was had profound feelings of guilt, given that she was in a position of power to do something and didn't do it. Another just felt sad, and a third was angry. I help bury people who I know and loved. I sat in an ICU watching a friend with more tubes than I thought a human could have. I sat with students of both Hillel and the School of Social Work who felt abandoned and lost. I've learned more about trauma, my own personal as well, trying to help my community recover. All of this because someone didn't like Jews. I want to thank you for your patience and for listening to me. If you want to know more about what we're doing in Pittsburgh, the work we're doing in trauma, I'm happy to talk about it another day or after this session. I would add to the list of resources that if you want to help educate yourself, go to Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, and you will find a tremendous piece on progressive movements and anti-Semitism. And I thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. You know, I've been a member of this conference for, I don't know, over 20 years, and I presented here a lot, and I was on the board. But I've never been, I was very nervous about today and about this presentation, which really speaks to kind of what we were talking about how anti-Semitism works. And just, I love this panel of Jewish people and all of this diversity, and we don't agree on everything, and we have different perspectives to bring, but this was a really good start. And I'd like to ask for people to come forward if you want, and also to talk. So we have some time, and I think there's probably a lot of big feelings in the room, and would love to hear your thoughts. Yeah.
So first, I really want to thank the panel. That was an absolutely fantastic panel. And I have to say that I almost fell off my seat when the announcement came out that there was this special session. Because
Yeah.
I haven't heard much talk about Judaism, and as I was walking in the room, I tried to figure out if all the people in the room were Jewish.
Not everyone, maybe.
Yeah.
I wanted to share two experiences. One was I was teaching an undergraduate HBSE course on part of it was about different cultures, and the students were reporting on the different ones. And the student who was doing something about Chinese culture, Asian culture, talked about the Chinese are seen as the Jews of the Orient because they were bankers.
Yes.
And I kind of was like,
Yeah.
and I thought the student made it up because I was just like an actually in the book. So I knew the person who had edited the book, who happened to be a director of the School of Social Work, and I got in touch with her and I said, oh, I was really concerned to see this in that chapter. And she said, well, it's an edited book. I didn't write that chapter. And one other thing I want to mention, and it's enough years have gone by, and most of the people are dead, so I can tell the story. So many of you know I've been with NASW for a very long time. And in 1992, someone who was Jewish was named as executive director. And someone else who was Jewish, who was a dean and head of several business national organizations, set up a lunch with the new director of NASW and came to him and said, I am so, and I was at this meeting, this is how it was. I am so shocked that someone who is Jewish was hired as executive director of NASW because to a large extent the Jewish leadership of NASW had left, I believe in the 60s or 70s around the time of the People War, one of the wars, and there was a big sort of schism over, I don't know exactly the issue, but there was a big schism between the blacks and the Jews. There was a big schism between the blacks and the Jews at NASW. So a lot of the people who were involved in the Jewish communal movement, people came from Pittsburgh, sort of left the leadership positions of NASW, and as NASW sort of developed its affirmative action rules and things like that. But I was like just floored sitting in this meeting in 1992, kind of learning some of this history, and this person's surprised that someone who was Jewish had been named executive director. Unfortunately, his job didn't last very long because he became ill and he died. But this is a very important conversation to have, and I had the opportunity to go to another workshop that Sherry did recently, and she also talked about sort of Jews and racism and sort of how that plays, and I think that's an important conversation as well. And thank you all very much.
Anyone can respond.
Yeah. I was just going to.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something. I've started speaking more of what I call the hook, which is the intersection of anti-Semitism and racism, and in particular, white Ashkenazi Jews with black Gentiles and where we get systematically pitted against each other. And I think understanding that is a really important dynamic. And I'll just, I don't have a flip chart, so I'm just going to kind of imagine this circle. The way I talk about it is that, and you talked about how long, Jewish oppression is 2,000 years of hatred. So the flames of 2,000 years of hatred, the phrase I use a lot for white Ashkenazi Jews is that we are scared active. And the way I like to talk about that is if a white Gentile is scared, maybe they'll hide out in their bedroom. If a Jew is scared, they might build 10 new organizations. That the fear propels us to activity with a lot of terror. So you have scared active from 2,000 years of hatred underneath, and some of those behaviors are wanting to be in charge to be safe, wanting to be in control of things to be safe. When those behaviors interact with black African heritage Gentiles, that's racism. And then what comes at us is abandonment, hatred, anti-Semitism. And that cycle and that dynamic, now that's in interpersonal relationships, but our peoples get systematically pitted against each other, and understanding those dynamics is really, really important.
We have, if people want to line up maybe by the mic or whatever.
Should I put it over here?
Sure.
I don't know how that
Great.
fits. Well, number one, I'd like to thank you're not on the board anymore, but you were last year. And for me, this is refreshing. I've come to lots of SSWR conferences, and for those of you who were at the board meeting last year, I was furious after the plenary, particularly on how the description of Israel was described without context and out of context in the way that you defined it. I think this is in part a response to that complaint, but also to the absence of anti-Semitism. There was a second one, so you'll be aware, I'm not sure why they were split, on Israel and the work that social workers are doing in Israel with Jews and Arabs to actually create better settings and better places. That was this morning, so the two were separated out. And I think that's not by chance that they were separated out. And I do want to bring up your point again of the issue of Israel being a litmus test, number one. But two, as a professor on campus, what I'm seeing, particularly with the African American community and Latino community now, is the narrative. I'm not allowed to have my own personal cultural narrative about my own people. So instead, I walk into meetings and people say, well, you're a colonialist because we have studies in Israel to create peace, to actually do all that stuff. And BDS gets involved with that. And people feel that if you're working in Israel, you're working with the government, you're working with Jews and Arabs there, whatever, you're part of the colonialist story. I don't get to define that or to say, actually, my people believe that we are natives of Israel, many of us going back, and the oppression has moved us around through refugees. That dialogue is not allowed to exist on many campuses, and I'm concerned about that. And the second piece is the connection with white supremacy, which I completely understand from an African American and black and brown perspective in terms of the need to acknowledge privilege. There's no question that we need to acknowledge that. But on the other hand, I'm less than one generation of my family members being burned in the camps because of white supremacism. And we were just recently defined outside, socially constructed as being white. It's very difficult for self-identified Jews to actually have to have that be connected with that white supremacist label when it's still alive and well. That part I don't feel we've really tackled here today, and I think it's alive and well on our campuses, that many of our faculty members still think that, many of our upcoming students are still dealing with it, and I don't think we're getting support on anti-Semitism because of those particular connections to Israel, colonialism, and white supremacy. I'd like to hear your comments. Right?
It's a lot. So.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ron. I mean, we can comment briefly, and maybe it's also just an expression because a lot of people want to say things. So, thank you.
Well, I'll just say I just got a grant. I'm going to be on 5 campuses in New England training Jewish students, faculty, and staff. The way I like to talk about it is to have the muscle to stay in coalition and take on anti-Semitism. What's been happening on campuses for lots of Jewish students is that there's these, again, like the rigidities in our country overall, there's these two ends. You're either rah-rah Israel, or you want to have nothing to do and you hate Israel and want to join with the boycott, divest, sanction movement. And those are the options. And then everyone else is silent and terrified. And so we're going to be launching this project, and it's to really build a model that trains to, and I will say I identify as a white Ashkenazi Jew, and I personally think that white Ashkenazi Jews do need to work on racism. There's a great book, When Jews Became White, but we're at this period, I think it's important, and I don't think it in any way diminishes being able to look at being Jewish and the issue of anti-Semitism as well. I think they're both important.
So let's try to take comment over here and then comment over there, and we'll see how far we get. Thank you.
I'd like to start. I want to just say 2 things about, but triggered by what we just spoke. So I've taken groups of students. I'm from Hunter College, Terry Mizrahi, and for 4 years I took students, and we have a very diverse student body to Israel. And the outcome for my Jewish friends, there's some Israeli friends here in the room, to say, what's the outcome? What would you like? To be able to say, you know what? I didn't know it was so complex. That's the only thing that they want as an outcome. This literally black and white, it's this or this, is something that I think we have to deal with. You can wear 2 identities, you can have contradictions, you don't have to be so certain or be in one camp. And I could say, I love the Jewish people. I love what's happening in Israel. There are people working to make change. So I was there in 2006 and when the Iraq war was on here. And I said, why are you going to the U.S.? All my European friends. We have a government of George Bush. Oh, you're going in spite of George Bush. Well, how about can people go to Israel, work with the people in spite of the government? They couldn't figure out that the people are not the government and you could struggle. So that was sort of one thing. And I had students who didn't think we should take people to Israel. And I said, fine, you want to come back and then talk from experience. I mean, I think that's what we have to do. So in class, I want to turn back to social work. I'm a professor and taught. So I think that I would like to distinguish or have students distinguish or colleagues between valid generalizations and stereotypes. So we teach that. Don't we teach that, one person doesn't make a whole, or there's differences among. But there are valid generalizations. So I started an exercise. I told students to write down and throw on a piece of paper in the middle of the room all your stereotypes. What do you think when you say Jews? What do you think when you say blacks? What do you think when you say Hispanics, and so on? And to open them up and to start to deal. Jews like money, or Jews are in the diamond industry, or Jews are bankers, or they take over whatever. And I said, you know what? A lot of that's true. A lot of it's true. Well, why were Jews? And so we had to get to, is it because my skin color is different? I have different DNA because I'm Jewish? Or because it's the only thing you could take? You couldn't own land. Oh, Jews didn't own land? When did they not own land? Well, how about 2,000 years of history in Europe? So you don't have a necessarily allegiance. So you're starting to teach the difference between having that feeling. Where did it come from? It didn't come from out of the nowhere, right? So we have to deal with where do those generalizations that become stereotypes come from? And by the way, I think it's more than 2,000 years old that's anti-Semitic, that Jews were oppressed. Sherry, just to say, I think so, depending on what books you read, or how far back you want to talk. But that exercise, I'm going to end with a very specific personal thing, because I went from a neighborhood, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, where everybody was Jewish for the first 10 years. And you think, if those of you not New Yorkers, think of New York as a cosmopolitan place. No, it's a series of neighborhoods, very segregated neighborhoods. So the two very quick things is we moved from a Jewish neighborhood to an Italian Catholic neighborhood. All white, but all of a sudden we were 3 Jews in the school. And in New York City, some of you may not know that at 2 o'clock on Wednesday afternoons, they let all the public school kids go to Catholic, what they called catechism. And 3 Jews had to sit behind. I dreaded in the 5th, 6th, and 7th grade, those Wednesday afternoons. I dreaded it to be the other. And my parents didn't do much to help with that, because they felt that the whole world was Gentiles and Jews, because they came from that immigrant experience. So somewhere I had a boyfriend in the 7th grade, and his name was Tommy, and one day he said, I'm sorry I can't take you to the dance on Friday, at this church. I said, okay, it's okay. I felt bad. And then he said, tell me, Terry, somebody told me you were Jewish. And I said, yeah. He said, well, I said that couldn't be true because you're so nice. 7th grade. But that's not the moral of the story. The moral of the story is I thought it was a compliment. I took it as a compliment, and that's the oppression, right? That I wanted to be like them. Yeah. So I just think that that's the kind of stuff we have to start with our own stories wherever we are, and deal with our own ambivalence.
Thank you. And a lot of that's about assimilation patterns, too, which we didn't get to talk about. On this side?
Hi. So I'm also from the New York area. I'm at Rutgers. And I just wanted to mention that I think one thing that kind of complicates this and we should also think about is that in New York City, over 25% of Jews live in poverty. And there's a massive Orthodox, or sometimes called ultra-Orthodox, although I know people don't like that term, community that are visibly very Jewish based on the way they dress. And that also within that community, there are tremendous social issues going on, from everything from substance abuse to high levels of interpersonal violence. And and also that this group has also been, at least in New York, while we see on this national level, in New York we've seen a massive uptick on anti-Semitic incidents on the street. And sometimes these incidents are not perpetuated by what you would call a white nationalist. White nationalist rhetoric has probably certainly contributed to what's going on. If you look at the data, it's often youth who are, it's not necessarily violent crime, but it's harassment on the street. And so I think that's important just to keep in mind. It's another way to think about this. I would also say that these are communities that our students are placed in, and actually one of my colleagues worked in a program for, he ran an MSW program for ultra-Orthodox women only, because only women could be in the classroom, but they were receiving their MSW. So I think that there are many different ways to kind of think about what social work can do in terms of addressing this larger issues.
Yeah, and part of the complication too is it's a small community, 2% of the population, but extremely diverse too. And while most Jewish people assimilate or you can't tell, right, always who's Jewish, there is that segment of folks, who, have distinguishing dress and other aspects that make them easier targets of violence and other hate crimes.
I want to say thank you for bringing this up, and I think your remark right now about the ultra-Orthodox Jews is very important. And I think I can start from my personal place without making it too long. We moved from Israel a year and a half ago to Long Island. I got a postdoc at Stony Brook, and for the first time of my life, I was a Jewish minority. And that was a very, very strange experience for me. And then I want to take this to the place of education, and the word complex or complicated came up a lot, and I think that there's a few ways and places where we need to address this complexity, and I want to bring up, so last year doing Israeli Holocaust Memorial Day, we were in the US, and in Israel it's a very significant day, a nationally significant day, and I wanted my kids to not forget that type of thing. And incidentally, there were 2 electricians that were working in my house that day, and these were educated young men that had recently, I guess, graduated from high school and college, and I kind of tested them out, and I said, do you know about the Holocaust? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, do you know how many Jews were killed or murdered in the Holocaust? And they said, yeah, we heard about how they were taken to places and they were killed. And I'm like, how many do you think were killed? And one of them says, I don't know, maybe 4,000 or 5,000. And he's like, no, much more, probably 20,000. And I was shocked. And I wrote this in my Facebook, and someone said she had to test it to, maybe they were ignorant, the electricians. So she went around her work and asked the same questions. I got very similar replies. So that takes me to one side of education that I think maybe is failing right now, in understanding, the history of the Jews and how they've been oppressed for many years. And the other thing is the complexity of Israel. So in another hat of mine, I'm a Hebrew school teacher at our Reformed temple, and I teach 5th graders, and following different research, they decided to change the curriculum about how to teach about Israel, and I'm now using a textbook called Israel, It's Complicated. Because it's a very complicated issue, especially for Jews or liberal Jews. So yeah, that was my 2 cents. And if you are interested in Israel, this is a bit of a I'm publicizing myself. I'm about to talk about fertility intentions in Israeli women in the session right now. So.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Steve Siegel. I think it's important that we confront I know the alt-right is 70% of the anti-Semitic activity, but 30% comes from the progressive movement who we feel we belong to. And it's not necessarily, how do you say it? I don't think it's so much about dividing or the political activities of this, because Jews have this mission of tikkun olam, to improve the world. And so I think when we think about our own experience of anti-Semitism, we don't talk about it. You know.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. Okay.
Jews were ordered, historically in this country, Jews have been discriminated against. General Grant gave the Jews 48 hours to get out of the South during the Civil War. Jews are hanged in the South. Oh. My family came here to avoid pogroms in the Ukraine. I share this with Tina. Part of my family were killed at Baba Yar. I grew up in Brooklyn, where I thought everybody was Jewish. I came to Ann Arbor with my wife, who taught in Chelsea, Michigan, which is a little town outside of Edinburgh, Ann Arbor. And right around Christmas, my wife, who is, by the way, an incredible elementary school teacher, has received all sorts of awards for this. She did Christmas songs, and the principal said, "Oh, that's good, but you have to include these other songs about Christmas." And my wife, who's sort of outspoken, said, "Well, I can't. I'll do all sorts of Christmas songs, but not religious songs." Following those statements, my wife was harassed. The principal came in and started to take notes about her. They started to observe her every day. We then started to get calls in the middle of the night saying, to wake up at 3 in the morning, you better go home, you Jewish commie bastard. The union at the school took my wife's side. The people who took my wife's side, their mortgages were called from the bank. We called from the bank. Ultimately, the union in the town was destroyed, but we were continually harassed. So much so that that my wife, because she wanted to protect the people who protected her, resigned, and ultimately was another superintendent, fortunately, outside of Ann Arbor, gave her a job. We need to talk more about the Jewish experience of anti-Semitism, personally.
Yeah, thank you. I know, this is really how we teach. We take people's stories and we know that it's not just what happened to, it's personal and then it's more, right? It's personal and it's systematic and it's personal, and then we connect with other groups, and that's kind of the goal of what we're trying to do here, right? And I see that this has opened up, I'll be the social worker, a lot of big feelings, and I notice the folks, speaking out are those mostly who are Jewish in the audience, and part of that shows me that we haven't had this space, right? And so I want to thank Alan and the committee for allowing us to create this space, but it does also show that we need more. I know 2 other people wanted to make comments, and we're pretty much out of time, so I'm going to invite you 2 to come up and talk to us while we close this session. And I just want to give a big thank you to all of you for being here, for sharing, for crying, for all of it. It's really very moving. Thank you so much to all our panelists.